Welcome back to Criminal Law class. In today's class, I will introduce the concept of defences in criminal law. By the end of this class, I hope you will have a firm understanding of the categories of defences available in criminal law, including general and specific defences, complete and partial defences, and how legal burdens operate when a defence such as intoxication or self-defence is raised. Let's start with a reminder. The foundational formula for establishing criminal liability for most criminal offences, except strict liability offences, is actus reus plus mens rea minus the defence equals criminal liability. The actus reus is the physical element of the crime, the guilty act. The mens rea is the mental element of the crime, the guilty mind. And we explored two specific mens rea in previous criminal law classes: intention and recklessness. A defendant will generally therefore be guilty if both actus reus and mens rea are present, unless a defence applies that negates or justifies their conduct. And let me explain briefly, why do some defendants plead not guilty? There are two general reasons why a defendant may plead not guilty to an offence they have been charged with. The first reason may be a defendant argues that they are not guilty of the offence because they deny involvement in the offence. In criminal law speak, the defendant may argue that they did not commit the actus reus at all. So for example, the defendant says they were not at the scene of the incident or they have an alibi witness confirming they were elsewhere. Or the defendant says they have been wrongly identified as the offender, a case of mistaken identity. Imagine a defendant is accused of robbery, but CCTV shows he was at work in another city. This is a denial of involvement in the offence of robbery. The second reason a defendant may argue they are not guilty of an offence is, while the defendant admits their conduct, they argue that the law provides a defence to their conduct. An example would be where a woman punches a man in the street but claims she believed she was about to be attacked. She may raise her use of force was for a legitimate purpose in self-defense, which is a legal reason to justify her conduct. In criminal law, there are two types of legal defences: general defences and specific defences. Admittedly, they're not perfect categories, but helpful ones in these criminal law classes. General defences apply across a wide range of criminal offences. Examples of general defences include self-defence, duress, insanity. In our criminal law classes, I will be focusing on self-defence. In contrast, there are also specific defences. Specific defences apply only to particular or some limited criminal offences. Take the offence of murder. Specific defences include intoxication. Voluntary and involuntary intoxication is a defence. Then there is another way of looking at defences: complete defences and partial defences. A complete defence leads to a full acquittal of the defendant. An example of a complete defence would be self-defence. And then there are partial defences, which reduces the liability. An example of a partial defence would be diminished responsibility, which would reduce a murder charge to a manslaughter charge. One final point before we finish this class. It's important to know how the legal burden, the evidential burden, and the standard of proof operate with respect to defence put forward by a defendant. As a reminder, in criminal law classes, the legal burden is on the prosecution to prove that the defendant satisfies all the elements of the offence, e.g. the actus reus and the mens rea of the offence, and the defendant does not have a defence. The evidential burden is initially on the prosecution, who must provide sufficient evidence to show that the defendant has a case to answer and to justify a finding of guilt. Where a defendant puts forward a defence of, say, self-defence or involuntary intoxication, the defendant has only an evidential burden to raise sufficient evidence for them to justify at trial, that is, to put forward some credible evidence to make it a live issue to support their defence. This may be as simple as a defendant giving evidence at their trial. Now, the standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt, so that the jury or the magistrate should convict the defendant only if they are sure of his guilt, as per the case of Wilmington versus DPP. Where a defence has been put forward, the prosecution would have to disprove the defence beyond reasonable doubt. So if self-defense has been put forward by the defendant, the prosecution would be required to disprove the use of force was not for a legitimate purpose and or was unnecessary in the circumstances and or the amount of force used was unreasonable in the circumstances. And yes, we'll be looking more carefully at self-defense in a future criminal law class. So to summarize, a defendant may put forward a defense of not guilty due to a denial of involvement or by successfully using a legal defense like self-defense or intoxication. Defenses can be general or specific, complete or partial. In self-defense or intoxication defenses, the defendant only has an evidential burden of proof to raise the defense at trial, and then the prosecution must ultimately disprove the defense beyond reasonable doubt to secure a conviction. Now, in our next criminal law class, I will explore what intoxication means in criminal law and how the law distinguishes between voluntary and involuntary intoxication and why this is important in the context of what would be and not be a defense to a criminal offense. Thank you for watching. Feel free to comment, follow and subscribe for more.